The Friends, Part 2. The four men had managed to navigate through the crowd. Carefully and methodically, they had carried their friend up the stairs, and now they were on the roof. Listening carefully, they pinpointed the spot directly above where Jesus was speaking. Each man stared at that spot, anticipating, knowing what the next step required. Now they had to dismantle someone's roof, lower their friend through their hole, and interrupt Jesus' teaching to ask, "Would you mind performing a miracle instead?" It felt presumptuous at best, but the risk seemed to simply motivate the friends further. Setting to work, the men carefully dug through the layers of clay, reeds, and thorns that formed the roof tiles. They did so respectfully, trying to keep the tiles intact as much as possible so the roof could be repaired easily. The man watched his friends work from the sidelines. It was humbling. Sincere loyalty was displayed so clearly by the tone of their actions. But the more he observed his friends' determined expressions and the tenacity in which they worked, their faith became palpable to him. With each tile they loosened and removed, they were closer to Jesus and closer to the healing they believed would happen. They did not doubt. They were not afraid. And he realized they didn't just think that Jesus could heal him. They firmly believed he would. His mind started to really consider, what if all this is true? What if Jesus is both powerful and kind? What if he actually does heal my body? That would mean independence, a social life, being able to work and earn a living. Perhaps, dare he even think it, the ability to marry and have children. His imagination was awakened to the possibility of a new life, and this imagination ignited excitement for what this Jesus' capabilities might actually be. 3 tiles had now been removed, and by the man's calculations, 1 more remained. With his heartbeat accelerating, the man realized that he wanted to be here. He wanted to risk hoping again. Bringing his mind back to the task at hand, he saw that his friends had placed his mat close to this last tile. He watched them dig their fingers along its edges to loosen it. Taking a deep breath, the man focused all his energy on his right hand. As he did, he managed to scoot it a few inches and rest a finger on the tile closest to him. And then he scraped a speck of dirt with his fingernail. Renewing his focus, he scraped off another and another and another. It was not much, but to him this was an outward act that symbolized a change happening inward. One of his friends noticed the man scraping, and he nudged the others. With 5 men now full of hope, together they loosened and lifted the final tile. The man exhaled, preparing himself for the final hurdle. Each friend patted his back assuredly, though he could perceive nervousness behind their thin smiles. This part of the plan required help they weren't certain they would get. One final time, the friends lifted up the 4 corners of the mat and with slow, measured movements began to lower the man through the hole. With their presence now fully known, they were met with looks of confusion and annoyance at this interruption. The man was scared. One slip of his friend's hands would send him tumbling downward about 6 feet. The man heard movement below, heard people scattering backwards and sounding alarmed. At this, one of his friends tried to explain why they were there and what they needed to do. The man couldn't see anything, but he heard a voice that had a depth to it, agreed to the plan. More movement. And suddenly there were hands underneath him. Strangers now bore his weight and awkwardly tried to guide him to the floor. Once clear, each of his friends lowered themselves down, jumping the last foot or so to the ground. Resuming their posts around the man, they carefully placed the mat on the floor and collectively exhaled. They had made it. The man realized his eyes were closed. This was by far the scariest thing he had ever done, and he was amazed to find himself unscathed. Opening his eyes, he took in his surroundings. They were in a courtyard of sorts, but the room was incredibly stuffy with all these bodies pressed together, and he was at the center of it all, the sole focus of the crowd's attention. He could feel their eyes taking him in, causing those unpleasant feelings of shame to quickly well up inside him. He hated his limp body, filled with muscles that had never been worked. "We're with you." His friends' voices drew him back. Behind him, his 4 friends had placed themselves in a half circle, creating a barrier between him and the crowd, reminding him he was not alone. So the man turned his focus to the person standing directly in front of him. Here stood Jesus. Jesus stood with strength, his feet and legs planted, his spine straight, his eyes confident. Some kind of power resided in this teacher. It emanated from him, and the man felt afraid. No, not quite afraid, but Jesus' presence was intense. The man felt like he was being presented to royalty, to some kind of king whose name commanded respect and allegiance. He felt unworthy of this presence. But then that voice, that deep voice spoke. "Take courage, son." And with this voice, the man felt something completely unexpected. Jesus somehow felt familiar to him, like their relationship had a history to it. Jesus' voice had the ability to communicate value and worth, making him feel as though he had 5 friends here, not 4. And this made all the difference. The man took courage. As if perceiving this, Jesus broke his gaze and took in the man's friends. Glancing up at the roof, he smiled, almost chuckling at their audacity. But he did not seem surprised. He nodded at them approvingly. Turning back to the man, Jesus bent down closer. The man drew in a breath, still not sure whether he should be utterly intimidated or feel completely safe around this teacher. Jesus' expression, though, encouraged the man to simply be present in this moment. They stared at each other for what seemed like an unnaturally long time, and as Jesus' eyes seemed to search him, the man began to feel exposed, but in a different way than he had ever experienced. The history, the familiarity that he felt with Jesus rose to the surface. Thoughts started to flow through his mind about his life, the choices he had made, the attitudes he had chosen to sit in, the anger he had with God for his condition. Though he was not outspoken about it, the man had become resentful and bitter. He had in many ways rejected God, rejected the kind of God that allowed him to be paralyzed and allowed other people to be so cruel. Being close to Jesus somehow drew all of these hidden thoughts out of him, made him feel guilty. And this guilt seemed connected to Jesus, like these sins had a direct impact on the man before him. It was just a feeling. His mind didn't quite understand it, but his very soul felt a great sadness over the idea. Tears came to his eyes. He was unable to stop them from spilling over onto his cheeks. Immediately, as if it was a basic instinct, Jesus reached out his hand and wiped every tear from his eyes. "Take courage, son," he said again. "Your sins are forgiven." He heard a collective gasp from the crowd, saw his friends exchange confused glances. This was not the outcome his friends had worked so hard for, not the miracle the crowd expected to witness. Jesus was insinuating an identity and authority that was frankly blasphemous. Jesus did not say God forgives you. He said your sins are forgiven, as in I personally forgive you, and I can. The heads in the room were spinning. But the man? This phrase left the man fully convinced, because this phrase, the way Jesus said it, the way he heard it, allowed the man to trust Jesus. His shortcomings, his guilt, his shame, he all but felt them being covered and forgotten by someone with the authority to do so. What relief he felt. He hadn't even known forgiveness was such a desperate need. Gratitude filled the man's soul, and he realized that belief was taking root in his heart. Jesus held the man's gaze for a moment longer, solidifying that yes, this feeling, this forgiveness is worthy of trust. Keep believing. But then Jesus' tone shifted. He turned his head to the side as if listening to something. Standing, he faced a group sitting to his right. No one had spoken, but Jesus stepped toward the group, who the man recognized as the Pharisees and other teachers of the law. As he approached them, Jesus' power and authority took prominence. "Why do you question this in your hearts?" Jesus implored them. Which is easier to say to this paralyzed man, "Your sins are forgiven," or to say, "Get up, take your mat, and walk"? But I want you to know that the Son of Man has authority on earth to forgive sins. His voice rose as he spoke, his calling and confidence evident. He turned in a circle, addressing the whole crowd with these words. The man's heart began to pound. The Son of Man, of course. Jesus circled back to face the man, his eyes shimmering with power and love and kindness and compassion. And with all the authority of heaven and earth at his fingertips, he declared, "I tell you, get up, take your mat, and go home." And the man got up. Doubt didn't even occur to him. He simply and immediately obeyed. But then it sunk in. He was standing. No muscle atrophy, no wait time, no weakness. Years and years of immobility vanished. He could feel the blood flowing in his legs. He could feel control returning to his arms, his legs, his feet. Slowly, he reached out his hands. He flexed his feet, shifted his big toe. It all felt incredibly foreign and unnatural, but he could do it all. He looked at Jesus, his mouth gaping. Jesus laughed heartily, clapping his hands on the man's shoulders. So much joy. And then the man remembered the rest of the words Jesus had spoken. Quickly, he bent down to retrieve his mat. He marveled at the feeling of muscles working in his legs as he bent his knees, the strength in his arms as he rolled up the mat. As he stood again, he realized with wonder that this was the first act he had done by himself in years. He proudly held that mat. Looking at Jesus, the man willed all the emotions and thoughts in his mind to be conveyed in his gaze. Jesus nodded. With almost a smirk on his face, Jesus indicated that the man should turn around. His friends. Turning, he faced them, and for the first time, the man could fully look them in the eyes. He was actually taller than a couple of them. Amazing. Their faces were absolutely priceless. One's eyes had widened to an unbelievable state. One was openly crying with his hand over his mouth. Two were beaming. They all immediately grabbed the man, shaking his shoulders, laughing, crying. Expressions of, "I knew it! We told you!" rang through the room. One of his friends opened his arms, inviting Jesus to join them. They all thanked him over and over and over. The man tried to capture this moment in his memory. 6 friends celebrating a triumph over paralysis and shame and isolation. Soon the embrace broke, and the man completed the last of Jesus' instructions. He walked out of the house in full view of everyone. As he passed the baffled faces of the crowd, he heard one say to another, "We have never seen anything like this." The man prayed that they would understand all of it. He willed every single person in the crowd to understand who Jesus was. He was the Son of Man, with the authority to forgive sins and the power to heal. He is who he says he is. Trust him. From what he could tell, some did understand. He saw different postures of worship. He saw expressions shift into ones of reverence. This thrilled the man almost more than anything else. He was compelled to tell his story because already he saw that this miracle was inspiring worship. Jesus had used him to reveal his identity. What a privilege, what a purpose. The man walked home, ran home, went backwards, forwards, and sideways. He danced, he leapt, he praised God, and his friends joined him. He gleefully refused their offer to carry his mat because he could. They played tag like children because he could. The journey was all joy and faith and victory. The Son of Man was here, King and friend, power and kindness, with